Hey, you're back. I'm back. That's great. We're going to pick up right where we left off yesterday. So, just to recap, yesterday we talked a little bit about Flutter, the project that we're going to build, and then we also talked about our quote CSV, and we wrote a quote CSV reader parser kind of thing. It's really lightweight, and we ran into some edge cases, so we wrote some tests to identify those edge cases and make sure that they were fixed. Today, we're going to pick up right there, and I think we're going to start with a class to hash the current date into some numbers that will help us identify what quote we're going to select for each day. So, for example, a certain day like today might hash into the number 4, which means we select the fourth quote. There are a couple different ways we can do this. We'll write a really basic way, and we'll kind of take it from there. So let's get started. Okay, great. This is not that project, so let's fix that. Philosopher's Stone. So I'm opening the project again. This is exactly where we left off yesterday. So we have a couple interesting things that we can do, and one actually stands out right away before we get started on the hashing. We probably want to show quotes, like the quotation marks, in our project, right? In 1 second, I'm just going to make sure this is the correct screen showing in OBS. Okay, it is. So we want to have these quotes show, right? But we don't necessarily want them in our data. In fact, it would be better if they weren't in our data. So we have a couple different options. We can go in and remove them all from here. This would probably be the easiest way to go about it, and arguably the best if our data set's not changing very frequently. The reasoning why is because in this case, we don't have to write any code to filter out these values. Kind of nice, but we're here to write code, so we're going to do it in code. So if we go to our quote loader that we wrote yesterday, we can go ahead and clean these quotes up a little bit. We have a couple different options. We can do this in the quote class when we new up a quote. So we could add a body right here that would kind of clean this up. So for example, text equals text dot replace all. And we want to replace those with nothing. So this is an option that we could do here. This gets a little tricky because these are final. This also probably isn't the best place to do that, so we're not going to do that here. And instead, we're going to keep this final and const, and instead, we will do it at our quote loader. So where we create our text right here. So this will be really easy. We have a couple things we want to do. In this case, we're going to change final to var because these aren't final anymore, because we're going to reassign text right here. And all we want to do is replace those quotes. So if you're unfamiliar with this, because we are targeting a quote and we need to pass in a string for the pattern here, we have to backslash this quote. If we don't backslash it, we get all sorts of weird stuff because this is a triple quote now and it's not a string. So we backslash this quote and we throw a semicolon at the end. So now that we do this, we can write another test. Let's start with a test, actually. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. So if we go back to our quote loader test, I'm going to copy this, paste this, and then we'll change the test so it says should strip quotes from the loaded quotes. How about that? So again, keep in mind this test is actually reading this file. So if this file didn't have any quotes in it, it might not be the best test because regardless of whether it has quotes in it or not, this might not be the best test. In theory, we should pass something in that is guaranteed to have quotes. That way our test guarantees that the quotes are stripped properly. But in our case, we're just going to parse this file as part of our tests. So something to think about. Generally, you might want to mock something here in the quote loader so that you are able to pass in something that guarantees that test case exists, like a quotation mark in the quote. Sorry, that's a little weird to say. But for now, we'll continue to just use that file. We'll remove this. And I want to do quotes dot for each. And we're basically just going to make sure that expect element dot includes. Oh, sorry, element dot text dot contains false. We'll get to this in just a second because that's a great piece of feedback. But basically, we're going to go through each quote and make sure that the text of that quote does not contain any quotation marks. This gets highlighted by VS Code for us, which is really nice. The reason why is that there's a code smell, I guess, that you would call it, that avoids function literals and for each calls. So instead, they want you to use a for loop instead of a for each. We're going to use VS Code's auto correct code actions to convert that for us. Let's go ahead and run this test. In theory, it should fail. Let's see if it does. Great, it failed. One thing we can do is we can give these a reason. So like you saw this error message, expected false, actual true. That's really not helpful. So let's give it a reason, right? So we can go here and we can say element dot text includes quotation marks. Now let's try this again. So if we run this, we'll actually see that reason this time. That'll help us out a little bit. The more we value things outside our control, the less control we have, includes quotation marks. Indeed it does. We can see those at the start of the line and at the end of this string. Now that we've written a test and it fails, let's make it pass. We've already written the code, so I'm just going to uncomment this. Now that we're here, we can run this code again, and it passed. Excellent. So now we're stripping the quotes out of our loaded CSV file. This is great. Again, we might put the actual quotes in the UI, but they don't need to be in our data set, so we're not going to keep them in our data set. We'll strip that out as we load it. Okay, so now we want to have, I'm going to call this quote selector. You could call it a hasher. It is a hasher, basically. So you could call it whatever you want, but we're going to call it a quote selector. And we're going to use abstract interface class. And let's give this a select by date. Great. So we've defined an interface class here. This is a Dart specific thing, but basically, so an interface class means that it can't be extended and has to be implemented. Let me make sure I'm 100% correct on that. Great. So all classes implicitly define an interface, therefore you can implement any class. Yep. The interface keyword. Use the interface modifier. Libraries outside the interface's own defining library can implement the interface but not extend it. That sounds like what we might want. Okay, perfect. So let's add a new select by date. And here's the thing. This is going to return a something, right? So in our case, we're going to have this be generic. We're going to use a generic T. Sorry, this should be select. We'll just call this select. It doesn't need to be called select by date. So now we have an abstract class, an abstract interface class called select by date. It takes in a T and then defines a select method that returns a T. The caveat here is that this select method needs to take in a date time. So we'll go ahead and define that too. Now that we're here, we can type implements select by date. We want this to return a quote, so we'll pass in quote where the generic type is. We'll import this, and we'll use code actions again to create our missing override. Okay, now that we're here, we can go ahead and remove this comment and the throwing of the unimplemented error. And now we want to write a select body. Thinking a little bit more about it, we have a date time, but we don't have our list of quotes, right? So what we're going to do is we can either have this take in a list of quotes, or we can pass it to this method. In this case, I think we're going to go ahead and take in a list of quotes. Great, so now that we're here, we can say quote selector. We need to make this required because this can't work without quotes. And now our select method doesn't have to worry about taking in a quote. So like we would have to update our abstract interface in this case, but instead our class can take in a quote and then our select method can select one. So figuring out a hashing function for this is actually going to be fairly straightforward. We basically want to look at the length of our quotes. So let's go ahead and write this out. So we have length is equal to quotes.length. And then we want to use the modulus operator to basically get a remainder. So if you were dividing a number like 1 divided by 2, if you're working with integers, would come out to 0 because 2 goes into 1 0 times. But if you were using modulus in that case, you would have a remainder. So modulus is what gives you the remainder. I'm actually going to open another project for a moment. And I'm going to show the hashing that I did for this project because it's actually really similar. Let's find the file. So this is the game that I built not too long ago in pure Flutter, and I'll probably do a video on this soon too. So in our case, this is a little more involved, but we take a hash code from a string. We'll do the same thing but with a date, and then we modulus by the supported number plus 1. So in our case, there are 83 supported options. In the case of our quotes, there will be 94 supported options. So we'll do 94 plus 1, or quotes.length plus 1. And then we want to switch on that hash, right? Or select from that hash. In our case, we don't have to switch. The reason that we do a switch on the hash in this game is because some things are more weighted. You're more likely to encounter a wolf than you are to encounter a ruins lore event, for example. But that's neither here nor there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab this, and we'll just plug it into our code. So we'll go back to Philosopher's Stone really quick. We're on our quote selector. We have our length. I'm going to go ahead and paste this. So our supported number is actually just the length, right? So what we can do is we can change this to length plus 1. And this is going to give us, oh, sorry, we need to change barcode hash code to something date time dot, let's see. How do we want to do this? We could do milliseconds since, no, that won't work. Sorry, we can't do milliseconds. We want it to change daily, right? So we could do, I guess we could do the day. We'll have to test that and make sure that works. But we can start there, and maybe what we should do is add a tester. So let's do that. For now, let's go ahead and return quotes sub hash. And let's type return properly. Okay, great. So this, in theory, should be pretty close. Well, we might have to change this. This logic might be slightly off, but we won't know until we write a test. So let's go ahead and write a test, right? So we'll create quote selector test.dart. I'm going to take everything from the quote loader test, paste it in here. I will remove the second test that we've added. And then we'll go ahead and change this from quote loader to quote selector. Oops, I accidentally hit debug there. We don't need to run that yet. And instead we'll change the should to should select the same quote given the same date time. Actually, it's not even date time, right? It's really the same date. We don't really care about the time, we care about the day. Okay, so now we have a quote selector. We know that this takes in a list of quotes, so we have to pass that in here. I'm going to give it 3 quotes. This will be test 1. This will be text 1. Add a comma there. We'll copy this and paste this again. I will let this format itself. We'll change this 1 and 2. And we'll change this one and into a 3. Great, so we have our quotes. Now what we want to do is final quote equals, let's change this to a meaningful variable name like quote selector dot select, and then we want to give it a date time, right? So what we can do, we want these to be consistent. So I'm going to do date time, and you can pass in a year. So let's do 1990. That was a great year. And then these are optional arguments, but not named arguments. So the next thing is the month and the day, and that's all we really care about, right? So we'll do 1 and 1. So January 1st, 1990. So we've selected a quote, right? This is excellent. So let's ensure that quote, well, we actually don't know which quote this is first, right? Do we care? No, not necessarily. It might be nice to know. But what we'll do is we'll add another quote, and we'll select another quote from the same date time. And these should be the same, right? So we should expect quote is equal to quote 2. True. Reason, quote 1 is not equal to quote 2. Okay. Let's run this test and see what we get. In theory, this should pass. Or I'm expecting this to pass at least. Okay, it did. Excellent. I'm a little curious what quote we selected, right? So what we can do is we can write another test. And we know that we should not, or we should select the next quote given two consecutive days. So if we change quote 2 to be January 2nd, it shouldn't be the same quote anymore. And so if we run this test as is with the same expectation, it should fail. I'm going to see that happen. Okay, quote 1 is not equal to quote 2. That's great. We don't really know what they are. We could add that into our reason if we care. I'm going to run it one more time and debug it just to see what we get. Okay, so we're debugging it. We have test 2, and then we have test 3. So we know that for 1990, month 1, day 1, we get quote 2. I'm going to write one more test to make sure these wrap around, right? So on day 3, we should go back to quote 1. Now that we kind of know what these are too, should select quote 1 on January 3rd, 1990. This is maybe not a super flexible test, because if we were to change, actually in this case it would be, because we're passing in the quotes when we construct a quote selector. But if we weren't passing this in and we were inferring this from the existing list of quotes somewhere, like loading the CSV and using that value directly without being able to modify it in our test, we probably wouldn't want to check a hard-coded value like this. But because of the test data being mocked and passed in here, we can effectively test a hard-coded value, and it's not like a major concern. So let's make sure that this wraps back around, right? So I expect quote dot let's do author is equal to test 1. Quote, let's change the reason to selected quote is not quote 1. Again, this reason only shows up when a test fails, so it's helpful in debugging, like, what went wrong? Let's give this a shot. This should pass. Invalid value, not inclusive. Okay, interesting. So we see that our quote selector select failed on line 16. Let's take a look at that. You can see kind of why, right? Not an inclusive range. 0 to 2 with a 3. So we're selecting 3 from the range 0 dot dot 2. So we have 0, 1, 2. We're selecting the third item. So we probably have an issue with this. Actually, no, we don't have an issue with this because that's being factored into the modulus. So I think we need to subtract 1 from the ultimate value here. Let's find out. Okay, quote is not quote 1. So part of the reason why this is not true is because we just changed the logic here, right? We're subtracting 1 from the hash value. So what we can do instead is we can go here, and if we add 1 to the date, it should now wrap around. If this is true, we'll need to update our test because our test no longer is valid either. Or our test name is no longer valid either. Oh, I'm debugging. I didn't mean to debug. Okay, let's stop that really quick and try this again. So let's run this one. It looks like we maybe have another failure now too. Okay, so we have another problem, right? So it's -1 is the value that we're passing in. So this isn't gonna work. We can't just subtract from this. So let me think through this for a second and we'll see what our issue is. So we take in a date, time, and a day, and we modulus it by a number. So we take the length and we add 1 to it. I don't think we need to add 1 to it. Because the length is always going to be 1 more than the actual last index. So in that case, we're over selecting. We had a test fail that had passed previously. So let's go ahead and make sure that one works first, and then we'll get back to the test that we were working on last. Okay, quote 1 is not equal to quote 2. True when it should be false. Should select the next quote given to you. Oh, wait, these shouldn't be equal. Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, that was an interesting coincidence that passed originally. So quote, we're ensuring that these two things aren't equal because we're selecting 2 different quotes, right? If you select a quote on one day and then the next, they should not be the same unless there was only 1 quote in the list. Okay, great, that passed. Let's go back to this test. Selected quote is not quote 1. Expected true, actual false. I'm curious what our selected quote is. Let's find out. I think I might just have an incorrect date here. I think this might need to go back to the 3rd. Our quote is test 2. So yeah, we're 1 day off. The classic off by 1 error. So let's go back to this and update our date to be back to the original date that we were writing this for. So now we know that this wraps around. We should also be able to verify this one more time by saying quote 2, and then we can take the length times 2, right? So in this case, it would be 6. Let's make this a little bit more robust by moving quotes out to its own variable. And then we can pass quotes in here. And then we can use quotes.length. Should give us the first quote. Quotes.length times 2 should give us the first quote. And then also in this case, quote, well, that would be an improper date. So let's not do that. I was going to say the 0th date, but That's not a valid date, so that's kind of a nonsensical test in this case. That being said, generally when you do think something is kind of a nonsensical test, it's probably good to see how your application behaves in that case. Let's make sure that these two are correct. Okay, great, they passed. That's excellent. That means that it's wrapping around as we would expect, and we kind of have a predictable structure for this hashing algorithm. So one interesting thing here is that this is underlined in blue. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but then we'll get back to actually our project. So it says use const with the constructor to improve performance. We talked about this a little bit in the last video. Because we made this a constant constructor and we used all final properties, we can make these constant as well. In our actual application, this will matter quite a bit. In our tests, that's a small amount, but it's nice to make the squiggles go away and to write the best code we can when we can. So we can make these all const. And then we could do that again up here if we want to. You could also pull this out higher up, like into the group if you were interested, and not have to define it in each test. I kind of like for the tests to define everything they need for themselves in that test. So I generally don't do that, but sometimes I might pull things out to the group, and you should feel free to do that too. Okay, so we have a quote selector test now, and we have a quote selector. So in theory, we can wire these things up, right? So let's actually write a little tiny bit of Flutter, and then we'll wrap up for the day. So if we go to our main, and I'm going to close others, and then we want to close all of these. Great, so we're back here. Our iOS simulator is still running. I'm going to go ahead and run our application, right? We're going to go to this My Homepage widget, and we'll clean this up probably tomorrow so we don't have so much stuff in this widget. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to replace this text that says you've pushed the button this many times with a quote. We're going to select one. And the reason we're doing this today is because it will change tomorrow, and we want to verify that that's true. Again, we wrote tests around that. We can write even grander tests with end-to-end tools or, oh my gosh, what is it called? Widget tests. As we saw right here, there's a widget test. We can write widget tests to simulate the date and change things so that we can test that without having to actually wait a day. But since we're wrapping up for the end of the day anyways, it might be cool to see it change tomorrow, right? So we'll have to do a couple different things. We'll probably talk more about them tomorrow. I just want to make sure this launches really quick before we get into it. It does. Excellent. Okay. So we're going to add some stuff, right? So let's go ahead and remove everything in the children widget or the children list here of this column. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a future builder. So a future builder takes in a future and it takes in a builder. So this gets a context and a snapshot. Okay. The future is, we'll clean this up at some point. So if you've written Flutter code before or followed my other tutorials, this is really down and dirty compared to like using blocks or things like that. And we'll get to that too. We'll clean this up as we go, but I want to get something on the screen by the end of the day today. So we're going to do quote loader dot load. And then this gets a build context. This is way out of the scope for this video. If you're unfamiliar with this, I would definitely read the Flutter documentation on it, watch some videos from the Flutter team. It's really good. The content is really good, like the docs. It's also extremely critical in Flutter, so it's something you'll have to understand, so they've taken a lot of good time with the docs for it. But the short and sweet is that this is where this building takes place. So it's aware of other widgets and the tree that it's in and theming and stuff like that. It's a way to pass things around in a somewhat safe fashion. It's helpful. Okay, so we need to return something based off this future builder, right? So if snapshot, so this is an async snapshot with a list of quotes. So if we say if snapshot dot, let's say data, actually, let's do a couple things. We'll say has error. Oh, that's nice. Okay. Then we want to return a text that says something went wrong while loading quotes. Easy enough. We still have a red squiggle here. This is because we are returning something conditionally, but we're not always returning something. So we'll do another one. We'll say if snapshot.hasData. This will be the actual quote that we want to return, right? So we'll return, we'll actually change some stuff here in just a second, but we'll return a column, and this column will have children, and both of these will be text, right? So our first column will be snapshot.data. What does this give us? Length. Oh, okay. This is important. This quote loader returns the entire list, right? So what we need to do is we need to create a date and use that. We'll pull all of this out so it's not in the view in a later video. In fact, we'll probably do it in the next one because it kind of grosses me out doing it this way. But for now, we just want to get something working, so this will work. So we want to create a date equals new date time dot now. And snapshot.data is that list of quotes, right? So what we want to do is we want to say quote selector. And then our quotes is snapshot.data. And then we want to call select, and we want to pass in the date time. And then we want to store this somewhere so we don't have to call this multiple times. So this will be quote. We can paste that right there. I'm gonna null assert this because if it has data, then this value should be not null. We probably will do a better job with that when we pull this stuff out and actually type check that and make sure that there aren't errors or anything like that, that it's not null. But for now, we can say quote.text, and then the next one will be quote.author. Again, we still have this red squiggle. Our code won't compile because I forgot a semicolon right here, but also red squiggle is still here. The reason why is we're not guaranteed to be returning something, and our builder function has to return something. So if we return I'm gonna return a circular progress indicator. At one of my previous employers, these things felt like they were all over the place for this exact same reason, and we followed this pattern quite a bit, although with a different builder, not a future builder. We used a block builder. But the idea was that if there's an error, we show an error. If there's data, we show the data. Otherwise, you're getting a spinner. Again, this can be constant. We'll go ahead and follow that pattern and make it constant. So if we refresh, you can see we have a quote. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. That's Marcus Aurelius. That's a great quote. Let's test one more thing for the day, and then we will wrap up there. In Dart, you don't need the new keyword, so we can go ahead and remove that. This also can be constant. And here's what I want to change. So we have a date, right? Let's take date and let's add. We can add duration, days, 1. Do a little bit of date math, add a single day to this, and then if we refresh it, we should get, well, nothing changed. Why is that? I think that is because our future builder is already built. So if we click the restart up here, ooh, did it not change? Interesting. What did I do wrong there? Let's change this to more days and see if we get anything different. No, interesting. I'm going to put a debugger right here, and let's just make sure this quote is what we're expecting. So in this case, our quote is from Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not the outside. Our date is 12/3. Oh, how silly. This returns a new date, doesn't it? It does. It returns a new date with the duration added to this. So we're not storing this anywhere. So what we can do is a couple different options. We can make this a var, and then we can say date is equal to date.add, durations 4 days. 4 should definitely give us another quote. So I'm going to go ahead and run this again. Turn off my debugger. And then let's reload this one more time. Yeah, okay, that definitely changed. So we have a new quote, and it's still Marcus Aurelius. Let's see if we can get a little farther in. Let's add 15 days. Still Marcus Aurelius. He's very popular. 19, Seneca. Great. While we wait for life, life passes. Beautiful quote. And we're going to wait for life until tomorrow. So that's where we're going to stop for today. We now have quotes on the screen. One last thing. Let's revert this change. We don't want to add 19 days. And instead, we'll make this a final. So we've got Marcus Aurelius on the screen. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Tomorrow, we should have a different quote. And let's make sure that happens, right? This is where we're going to wrap up for today. I had a lot of fun with this. I'm glad we actually have something on the screen now and we're not just writing Dart code. So yeah, we'll pick up tomorrow. And what we'll do tomorrow is clean up a little bit of this mess. And then we will look at adding some interactivity. So maybe like a button that pops out a bottom sheet that prompts you to log your thoughts. Then we get into the really fun stuff like storing it. So I don't think we'll hit that point tomorrow, but the next thing on the table, the next big meaty chunk of work is taking in user input and then storing that in a database. Before we go, one last thing. I'm back with the Santa hat. I am gonna be very honest with you. I would love to do more of this. And to make that happen, I need to hit my monetization requirements. So I would really appreciate it. I'm not going to hit you with the smack that subscribe button or anything silly like that because that's just not really who I am. I want to teach and I want to help people. So if you found this enjoyable or helpful at all, I would really appreciate it. If you aren't subscribed, please consider it. You do you. Any interaction helps me become more popular in the YouTube algorithm. So if you liked the video, leave a comment, let me know your thoughts. If you want to share it with your friends or someone you might think this is valuable for, someone who wants to learn how to build mobile apps. You've seen it now. We're actually at the point where we're building a mobile app. We're doing things that change the UI. I would just really appreciate that. I've been working hard on this for a while now. I'm kind of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't for me. And your support would mean a lot to me. That's it.